World War II is considered to be more of a total war than World War I for the following reasons. Learning from World War I, governments made every effort to ensure the fullest mobilization and most efficient utilization of human and material resources of the state. Also, because World War I had shown that productivity of the home front was key to victory, so World War II saw the home front under direct attack in a way that had not occurred in the previous conflict. Also, governments used all weapons at their disposal and developed new ones during the course of the war, weapons that were capable of killing far greater numbers of civilians than ever before. And lastly, in both the war in Europe and the war in the Far East, racial hatred led to the killing or relocation of vast numbers of civilians deemed to be untrustworthy or inferior. As with World War I, the aims of the powers involved in the war were total. Hitler's aims for Europe was clear: total domination and takeover of the USSR to provide living space for the German people. They also involved the elimination of races considered inferior, Jews in particular, and in all areas taken over by the Nazis, they did murder many different people. In combating these aims, the Allies could afford no compromise peace. They saw themselves as fighting for the freedom of Europe. The same was true in the Pacific, where the Japanese co-prosperity sphere, with its aims of political, economic, and racial domination, were considered unacceptable. Although Japan called for a negotiated peace in 1945, this was rejected by the Allies, who deemed total surrender necessary. The racial aspect of the fighting, involving as it did whole populations, injected a greater intensity into the struggle and ensured a bitter fight to the finish. As with World War I, propaganda on both sides reinforced the need for unrestrained warfare, while also demonizing the enemy and making total victory the only goal. Both sides used all weapons in their arsenals and developed deadly new weapons during the course of the war in an attempt to win at all costs. World War II saw major developments in military technology: radar, U-boat detection equipment, long-distance bombing, V-1 and V-2 rockets, and of course the atomic bomb. Of these, radar was to have a huge impact in future air and sea navigation. The V-2 weapons led indirectly to rockets for space exploration and nuclear missiles, while the jet engine would revolutionize air travel. The atomic bomb would affect how the Cold War was to be fought. There were other developments, too, stimulated by wartime needs that would have a big impact in peacetime. The large-scale production of penicillin, which was to be discovered in 1929, saved thousands of soldiers' lives and would save thousands of civilian lives after the war. The war also saw research into improved techniques for storing blood and plasma, and also plastic surgery for helping badly injured or burnt service personnel. Synthetic fibers such as nylon, which were used to make parachutes, would soon appear in all types of consumer products. Civilians were attacked in new ways during World War I and also suffered the effects of war in terms of rationing and deprivation. However, large casualty figures were made up mainly of the men of the armed forces. In World War II, these proportions changed profoundly. Whereas World War I, civilians counted for only 1/20th of the war dead, in World War II, they would count up to 2/3 of deaths. This shift was because of the power of new weaponry, the bombers, for example, and also because the new mobility of war brought the fighting to far greater numbers of people than had been in the case of World War I. There was an ideological and racial aspect to World War II that meant that certain sections of the population were deliberately targeted with the intent that they should be deported or even eliminated entirely. In Europe, this was evident on the Eastern Front following the German invasion of Poland and the Soviet Union. Hitler believed that certain races, in particular Jews, but also the Slavs, were subhuman. The space that was necessary for the Greater German Reich also meant that the existing populations in Poland and the USSR had to be destroyed or displaced. In one of the plans for German settlement drawn up by the Reich, it was estimated that the unwanted population would be closer to 50 or even 57 million. assuming that 15% of Poles, 25% of Ruthenians, and 35% of Ukrainians would need to be retained as agricultural laborers, the rest being deported to Siberia. The Russian population would wither away through the use of contraception, abortion, and sterilization. The Jews would be exterminated. Many Poles and Russians were deported to factories and mines of the Third Reich, where the work there ensured almost certain death for most of them. For the Jews, special SS squads accompanied the German army as it invaded Poland and the USSR, and had the job to kill all Jews, communist officials, and resistors they encountered. By the end of July 1941, the SS had murdered around 63,000 men, women, and children, 90% of whom were Jews. Groups other than the Jews were also at risk, such as the Roma and mental patients. The method of killing such large numbers of people was, however, very difficult. Mass groups of people were generally herded into remote locations and shot. The Nazis came up with a new method to deliver their final solution to the Jewish question, and that was the transportation of Jews from across Europe to concentration and extermination camps, where they could be eliminated either by poison gas or through overwork and starvation. The extermination camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau alone could kill 10,000 people a day. The Soviet government also deported whole populations. It assumed that the minority people in the West were disloyal to the Soviet Union, and thus the Germans on the Volga and the Tatars in the Crimean were deported. Estonians, Lithuanians, and Poles were all dispersed to Siberia and other parts of the USSR. The combination of lethal factors meant that the death tolls in Eastern Europe and the USSR during the war were terribly high. At least 20 million people died in the Soviet Union. Some estimates put that number much higher, and more than half of those were civilian deaths. Poland suffered the greatest proportional loss of life, with 6 million deaths out of a population of 30 million. 3 million of these were Jews, and only 150,000 of these casualty figures represent death in military action. Overall, an estimated 1 million Roma and 6 million Jewish civilians were killed by the Nazis in their racial extermination program. As the Soviets pushed through to Berlin in their final year of the war, they took revenge on the German population for 3 years of brutal warfare and the atrocities that the Germans had inflicted on the Russian population. One historian writes that chief among the victims were adult males, if any remained, and women of any age. 87,000 women in Vienna were reported by clinics and doctors to have been raped by Soviet soldiers in the 3 weeks following the Red Army's arrival in the city. A slightly larger number of women in Berlin were raped in the Soviet march on the city, most of them in the week of May 2nd to 7th, immediately preceding the German surrender. Both of these figures are surely an underestimate, and they do not include the uncounted number of assaults on women in the villages and towns that lay in the path of the Soviet forces in their advance to Austria and across Western Poland into Germany. German and Japanese civilians who found themselves living in Britain or the United States also suffered. It was assumed that their first loyalties would be to their country of origin. Thus, Germans and Austrians in Britain were rounded up and put in internment camps. In America, more than 100,000 Japanese were relocated into camps, many losing their property or being forced to sell at very low prices. In 1988, the U.S. Congress signed an apology for this policy and gave $20,000 in compensation to all surviving internees. The Japanese also had ambitions linked to racial superiority. One high-ranking general said, "The Chinese people are bacteria infesting world civilization." Such attitudes were commonplace, hence the genocidal Japanese treatment of the Chinese in The Rape of Nanking. Such brutality continued during the takeover of Southeast Asia following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Between 5,000 and 50,000 Chinese were massacred in Singapore in a series of purification by elimination operations. Overall, 10 million Chinese died at the hands of the Japanese. Filipinos, Indonesians, and Malays were also used as slave workers, resulting in thousands of deaths. Allied prisoners of war also suffered terribly from the physical overwork, malnutrition, and abuse. As with World War I, civilians were mobilized in all countries to help with the war effort. This effort was, however, on a much faster scale than in World War I. The major combatants mobilized between half and two-thirds of their industrial workforce and devoted up to three-quarters of their national product to waging war. This meant that apart from the U.S., the vital resources of the country were directed to the war effort, and the populations were therefore forced to live on restricted range of rationed food and household goods. The number of people required to both fight and to work in factories produce the necessary amount of war materials was vast, and countries used different methods to get the workforce that they required. In Britain, military conscription was introduced from the beginning of the conflict, unlike in World War I, but it was carefully controlled to ensure that key workers were left in important industries such as coal mining. Industrial conscription was also introduced for women, and thus women played an even bigger role in British industry, agriculture, and administration in World War II than in World War I. In Germany, there was little change to the economy at the beginning of the war, as early victories did not put much of a strain on the home front. But when Albert Speer, the Minister of Armament and War Production, tried to organize the deployment of human resources more effectively from 1942 onwards, he found little support. The regional and police authorities were reluctant to accept national schemes that affected their regions, and having women in the workplace went against Hitler's idea that women should focus on children, church, and kitchen. Hitler also insisted that consumer goods production remain a priority, and so workers in non-essential industries could not be transferred. In the Soviet Union, the already centralized nature of the state allowed civilians to be mobilized effectively from the beginning. Coercion played a key role. Workers were forced to move to those areas of the Soviet Union in which they were most needed. Hours of work increased, and crash training programs were developed to make up for the shortage of skilled labor. Slacking or absenteeism could be punished by labor camps or even death. In the Soviet Union, women made up most of the workforce, but also volunteered to serve in the armed forces. They joined the Red Army or the Red Air Force, and the latter had 3 regiments, 2 bomber and 1 fighter, consisting entirely of women. They're called the Night Witches. Look it up. They also played a vital role in the Red Cross organization and in civil defense and fire watching operations. Richard Overy calls the civilians of Russia the real heroes of the Soviet Union's economic revival after the Nazi invasion, due to the appalling conditions in which many of them worked, suffering under long hours, poor nutrition, and political scrutiny. In America, women also played a key role in war industries, doing semi-skilled jobs such as crane operators, tool makers, shell loaders, aircraft makers, and even lumberjacks. Go women! An estimated 350,000 women also joined uniformed groups such as the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, and the Navy Nurse Corps. As in Germany, the Japanese government was reluctant to use women in the workforce, preferring to use students rather than women. Though more than 2.5 million extra women did enter the workforce between 1940 and 1945, a much larger number did not. In all countries occupied by the Nazis, there were civilians who joined resistance groups. Also called partisans, they gathered intelligence for the Allies. They used sabotage and murder against the occupiers. They also helped rescue shot down Allied pilots and also took Jews into safety. Their work was extremely dangerous but very important. Niall Ferguson wrote in War of the World in 2006, as the Turks had treated the Armenians, as Stalin's henchmen were treating the Kulaks, Poles and other enemies of the people, as the Nazis were soon to start treating the Jews, Roma, and mentally ill. So the Japanese now thought of and treated the Chinese as subhumans. This capacity to treat other human beings as members of an inferior, are indeed malignant species as mere vermin, was one of the crucial reasons why 20th century conflict was so violent. Only make this mental leap and warfare ceases to be a formalized encounter between uniformed armies. It becomes a war of annihilation in which everyone on the other side, men, women, children, the elderly, can legitimately be killed.